He stopped for a stranger on the side of the highway. She was stranded, frustrated, and already late. He was a single father who hadn't been on a date in 3 years. Neither of them knew that a broken-down car and a ruined evening would become the moment that changed everything. Drop a comment with your city and hit that like button. Let me see how far this story travels. Now let's find out what happens when the wrong night becomes the right one. The Friday evening rush hour on Interstate 40 was exactly the kind of thing Ethan Cole had spent years learning to navigate without losing his mind. Not the traffic itself. He'd grown up in Wilmington, North Carolina, and knew every back road, every shortcut, every stretch of pavement that would buy him 10 minutes when the world was moving too slow. What he hadn't learned to navigate was the particular brand of anxiety that came from being a 32-year-old single father sitting in a truck that smelled like motor oil and fast food, wearing the only dress shirt he owned that didn't have a grease stain somewhere on it, driving toward a restaurant he'd never been to for a date he'd never agreed to. He'd agreed to it. That was the problem. He had, in a moment of weakness he deeply regretted, said yes. "Just one dinner," his sister Dana had said. "Her name is Victoria. She's successful. She's smart. She's your age. You've been alone for 4 years, Ethan. Sophie's 7. She's starting to ask questions." She asked questions about everything. Last week she asked me why clouds don't fall. She asked me why you don't have a girlfriend. That had landed differently. He'd been quiet for a second too long, and Dana had taken the silence as surrender. So here he was, Friday night, clean shirt, truck that probably shouldn't be representing anyone's romantic intentions. And he was already running 8 minutes behind because his daughter, Sophie, had decided at the last possible moment that she absolutely could not go to Dana's house without her stuffed elephant, Gerald. And Gerald had somehow ended up inside a laundry basket underneath 3 towels and a rain jacket. He'd found Gerald. He'd kissed Sophie on the top of her head. He'd reminded her twice that he'd be back by 10. She'd looked up at him with those serious brown eyes, the ones that had been killing him softly since the day she was born, and said, "You look different. Different good or different bad?" She'd studied him for a long moment. "Different nervous," she said. 7 years old. Absolutely lethal. He merged onto the interstate and pressed the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb to a reasonable but purposeful 68 miles per hour. The sky above Wilmington had gone the particular shade of amber and rose that only happened in late September, when summer was finally exhausted and fall was beginning to mean it. Under different circumstances, he might have taken a second to appreciate it. He was actively not appreciating it when he saw the car. A silver Mercedes-Benz sedan, GLE class, maybe 2 years old, maybe less, was pulled over on the right shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. The emergency triangles had been set out behind it in a neat row, which told him whoever was dealing with this situation was organized. The hood wasn't up, so it wasn't an overheating issue. He couldn't see a flat from this distance, but the way the car was sitting on the front passenger side told him plenty. He was past it before he made the decision. The thing about Ethan Cole was that he'd been fixing things his whole life, not because anyone asked him to, not because it made him look good. His father had run an auto shop out of a converted barn on the edge of town for 30 years, and Ethan had grown up with grease on his hands and the quiet satisfaction of understanding how machines worked. When something was broken, you fixed it. That was simply the logic of the world as he understood it. He checked his mirrors, eased onto the shoulder, and brought the truck to a stop about 40 feet in front of the Mercedes. The woman standing beside the car did not look like someone who needed rescuing. She was wearing a blazer over a blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a way that was professional and slightly undone at the edges. Not from carelessness, he would learn later, but because she'd been running her hand through it in frustration for the last 20 minutes. She had her phone in one hand and was looking at it with the expression of someone who had been on hold for too long and was close to making a decision she might regret. She looked up when he climbed out of the truck. There was a flicker of something, assessment maybe, or the particular kind of calculation women do when a stranger stops on a highway at dusk. He raised one hand, palm out, the universal signal for "I'm harmless, I promise." "Front right tire?" he called across the distance. She looked at the car, then back at him. "Does it look that obvious?" "The way she's sitting, yeah." He walked over slowly, not rushing, giving her time to get comfortable with his presence. She watched him approach with an expression that wasn't quite suspicious, but wasn't quite relaxed either. More like a woman who was used to evaluating people quickly and hadn't finished evaluating him yet. "Roadside assistance is telling me 45 minutes, she said, which apparently means an hour and 20. "Probably." He crouched beside the passenger front tire without asking permission. The sidewall had a clean puncture, maybe 3 inches up from the tread. Something sharp, driven in at an angle. "You've got a spare?" "It's a Mercedes." "I assume so." He glanced up at her. "You don't know?" "I know how to run a company," she said. "The tire situation is genuinely outside my area of expertise." He almost smiled. Almost. "Fair enough. I can put the spare on if you want. It'll take about 15 minutes. You'll want to get the actual tire fixed tomorrow. Don't drive more than 50 on the spare, and don't go over 50 miles on it." She studied him. "You're going somewhere." "I am." "And you're stopping anyway." "It's a flat tire," he said, like that explained everything. In his world, it did. There was a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds, and something shifted in her posture. Not dramatic, not visible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. But Ethan, who spent his life reading the small mechanical signals that told him what a vehicle needed, noticed. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." Her name, she told him while he was pulling the equipment from her trunk, was Victoria. She offered her last name a moment later the way some people do when they're used to the name meaning something, like she was watching to see if it registered. "Victoria Hale," she said. "Ethan Cole." He set the jack on the pavement. "Should that ring a bell?" "Hale Logistics? We manage supply chain operations for—" She paused. "You know what? Never mind. It doesn't matter." "It might matter to some people," he said. "I fix cars for a living. My frame of reference is pretty specific." She laughed at that. Not the polished, controlled laugh of someone performing amusement, a real one, short and a little surprised, like she hadn't expected to find anything funny about standing on the side of a highway with a ruined tire and an oil-stained stranger. He worked methodically, the way he always did, his hands moving with the ease of someone who'd performed this operation more times than he could count. The jack went under the frame at the correct lift point. Not everyone knew where that was, and a wrong placement could damage the car significantly. He positioned it correctly, without having to look for it. "How long have you been doing this?" Victoria asked. "Fixing cars? Since I was about 10. He began loosening the lug nuts in the star pattern. Crosswise, not circular, so the rotor seated evenly when he retightened them. "My dad had a shop. I grew up there." "And now you have your own?" "Cole's Auto, off Market Street." He glanced up. "You from Wilmington?" "I live here. I'm not from here." She said it in a way that suggested there was a story attached to that distinction, but she didn't offer it, and he didn't push. The light was changing. The amber had gone deeper, the first edge of purple creeping in from the east. The hazard lights blinked their patient orange rhythm. Cars moved past them on the highway, with the particular indifference of people who were glad not to be the ones stuck on the shoulder. "You said you're heading somewhere," Victoria said. "Dinner." "A date?" He paused for just a fraction of a second. "Sort of. Blind date. My sister arranged it." Something in her expression shifted, amusement or recognition, or both. "Really?" "Yeah, I've been single for a while, apparently long enough that my sister decided to intervene." He pulled the flat tire free and set it aside. "You?" "Me what?" "You're dressed for dinner too," he said. "Blazer on a Friday night on the highway. Either that's just how you dress, or you're also heading somewhere." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Also a blind date," she said. He looked up at her. "Seriously?" "My assistant arranged it." She said it with the particular wryness of someone who had recently decided that was fine before discovering it was slightly mortifying to admit. I don't get out much. Professionally speaking, I have a very full calendar. Personally speaking, it looks like the surface of Mars." "What do you know about the surface of Mars?" "Barren and hostile," she said. "Not great for dinner plans." He laughed. It wasn't a polished laugh either. It was the laugh of someone who didn't perform amusement, just experienced it. She noticed. "So you're running late," he said, setting the spare against the hub. 11 minutes late as of... She checked her phone. 12 minutes late. I'm 8 minutes late. We're both terrible at this. First date, he said, already establishing low expectations. That's efficient. She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when they've said something that landed differently than expected. You're funny, she said. I didn't anticipate that. What did you anticipate? I don't know. Silence. Efficiency. A man focused on the tire. I can be silent if you prefer. Please don't, she said, and there was something underneath that, something that wasn't quite loneliness but was adjacent to it, the voice of someone who'd spent a lot of time in rooms full of people and still somehow managed to be the loneliest person there. He didn't say anything to that. He threaded the first lug nut onto the stud and began snugging it down. The silence that settled between them after that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the specific quiet of two people who had run out of small talk and weren't sure whether the next thing was real talk or nothing at all. Victoria leaned against the side of the car, arms crossed, watching him work. The highway behind them had thinned. The sky had gone from purple to the deep blue of early night, and the first stars were visible over the tree line to the east. How old is she? Victoria asked. He looked up. Who? Your daughter. She nodded at the back seat of his truck, barely visible through the rear window. A child's backpack, a coloring book, something small and stuffed tucked against the door. You have a kid. The truck tells the story. He paused. Most people didn't notice things like that, or if they noticed, they didn't say anything. There was a particular kind of person who could read a room, or in this case, a truck cab. And Victoria Hale, he was beginning to understand, was absolutely that kind of person. Sophie, he said, she's 7. Just you? Just me. 4 years now. She didn't ask what happened, and he appreciated that more than he would have been able to explain. Most people asked. The ones who didn't were the ones who understood that the answer lived somewhere complicated and painful, and that a highway shoulder at dusk was probably not the right place for it. I don't know how people do it, Victoria said quietly. Raise someone alone. I have 43 employees and I can barely keep the coffee in the break room stocked. A whole human being, but... She shook her head. That's a different category entirely. You figure it out, he said, or you don't, and then you figure out what you got wrong, and you try again. He tightened the last lug nut and stood, brushing his hands on his jeans. There's no version where you do it perfectly. You just try not to do it badly too many days in a row. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not pity. He would have recognized pity, and he had very little patience for it. Something else. Something that looked more like recognition. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in about 6 months, she said. People usually tell you what you want to hear. People usually tell me what they think a CEO wants to hear. She pushed off the car, straightening her blazer. It's a different thing. He pulled the jack free, let the car settle on its own weight, and checked the tire pressure visually. Not perfect, but the spare was holding. He walked around to the driver's side and checked the other tires out of habit. Left rear was running a little low. He didn't mention it. She'd notice it eventually and have it handled. It wasn't critical. You're good to go, he said. I meant it about the speed limit. Don't push it. I won't. She pulled out her phone and glanced at the screen, then back at him. I'm now 15 minutes late. I'm 11. Where are you going? Brick's Kitchen and Bar. You? The pause was very small. Brick's Kitchen and Bar, she said. He heard the words. He let them exist in the air for a moment. Your assistant arranged this, he said slowly. Yes. Dana Cole is my sister. Victoria stared at him. The hazard lights blinked. A truck moved past them on the highway, its slipstream disturbing the air. Dana Cole is your sister, Victoria said. She has an office downtown. She does event planning. She's been telling me for 4 months that she has someone perfect for me. My assistant hired her, Victoria said, to arrange. I told Marcus I wanted to try a blind date, and he outsourced the entire thing to... She stopped. Your sister. Ethan looked at the car, then at Victoria, then at the highway, briefly, as if the road might offer some perspective on what was happening. So, he said carefully, the dinner is ours. she finished. Another moment. The hazard lights blinked again. And then Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Logistics, a woman who had faced boardrooms and acquisition attempts and a supply chain crisis that had made the front page of 3 trade publications, laughed, not the small surprised laugh from earlier, a real one. The kind that involved her whole face and bent her slightly forward and was entirely undignified and perfect. "You fixed my tire," she said, still laughing. "You fixed my tire, and you were already late to our dinner, and now I smell like tire rubber," he said, which made her laugh harder. He was laughing too. He hadn't planned on it, but there it was. They drove separately to Brick's kitchen and bar, arriving 17 minutes late and smelling collectively like a highway shoulder. The hostess, a young woman with the practiced patience of someone who managed dining rooms for a living, looked at them with the specific expression reserved for people who showed up late together and were pretending they hadn't. "Coal reservation," Ethan said. "Right this way." The table was in a corner, which Ethan thought was probably deliberate on Dana's part. She had opinions about these things. The restaurant itself was upscale without being punishing about it. Dark wood, warm light, a menu that leaned heavily on seasonal and local without announcing itself too aggressively about it. Victoria sat across from him and looked at the menu. He looked at his. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," she said finally. "Well," he agreed. The server came. They ordered water in a moment, and then they looked at each other across the candlelight and the white linen and the situation that had already defied most of the categories they would have put it in. "For the record," Victoria said, "this is the strangest first date I've ever been on." "Same." He paused. "What would you have expected? Before all this?" She thought about it. Awkward small talk, someone trying too hard, maybe a long speech about his apartment or his career trajectory. The sense that we were both auditioning. "That's not wrong." "And instead," she said, "you fixed my car." "Your tire." "My tire." And then we had a perfectly normal conversation on a highway and then discovered we were supposed to be having this dinner. "Life is weird," he offered. "That's one way to put it." The server returned. They ordered. She got the salmon. He got something with short ribs that he'd been thinking about since the menu appeared. They talked, not the way people talk on blind dates, running their mouths in the general direction of a stranger and hoping something lands. They talked the way people talk when they've already cleared the first awkward hour without meaning to, when the ice is gone and what remains is just conversation. She talked about the company, not in the resume recitation way, but the real way, the way that let him see what it cost her. She'd started Hale Logistics at 24 with a business loan and a commercial lease and 2 employees, neither of whom had previous logistics experience. She'd spent the first 2 years not sleeping. She'd made decisions she was still paying for and decisions she was still proud of in equal measure. The company now had offices in 3 states and a client list that included names he recognized from the news. "Does it feel like what you thought it would?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It feels like being responsible for something that's always bigger than you imagined," she said, which I think is true of most things worth doing. He thought about Sophie, about his shop, about the years after his marriage ended, when everything he'd assumed about his future had to be rebuilt from scratch, with whatever materials he had available. "Yeah," he said, "that's about right." "What about you?" she asked. "The shop? Is that what you always wanted?" "I always wanted to fix things," he said. The shop was the logical container for that. He turned his water glass on the table, a small, absent gesture. "My dad built his shop with his own hands. Took him 10 years. I never wanted to do something that big. I just wanted a place where I could do the work and raise Sophie somewhere that made sense. Wilmington made sense." "Because of family?" "Because of Dana, mainly. And because Sophie started school here and made friends, and pulling her out of that for something that might be better for me seemed like the wrong math." Victoria looked at him. "You made decisions based on what was right for her." "She didn't ask to be in any of this," he said simply. "The choices I make are still mine. The consequences go in her direction too." The restaurant around them had filled. Voices, silverware, the rhythm of a Friday night. Neither of them seemed to notice particularly. Your sister said you hadn't dated in a few years, Victoria said. Did she say it like a warning or a sales pitch? Both, I think, in the most loving possible way. She smiled. What made you say yes to this? He thought about it. Sophie asked me why I didn't have a girlfriend. Victoria's expression softened. Kids go right to the heart of things. She's 7. She doesn't know yet that those questions are supposed to be complicated. Maybe they're not supposed to be. She said it quietly. Maybe we make them complicated. He looked at her across the table. In the candlelight, her face was less the face of a CEO than just the face of a person. Someone who worked too hard and ate too many dinners alone and had, somewhere along the way, figured out how to wear success like a coat without quite forgetting there was a person underneath it. Your assistant, he said. What made you agree to this? Marcus looked at my calendar and told me I had not had a social engagement in 4 months that wasn't related to work. She picked up her wine glass. He was very calm about it. That made it worse. So this was a work issue. It was a Marcus is worried about me issue, which he expressed in professional terms because that's the only language I respond to. She took a sip. He's been with me since the beginning. He knows how I work. He outsourced your blind date, Ethan pointed out. He's efficient, she said, and there was warmth under it, the warmth of someone talking about a person they trusted. He knew Dana's reputation, and he knew I wouldn't have time to plan something myself, so he planned it himself. He planned it himself. She set the glass down. I was annoyed when I found out, and then I was stranded on a highway, so I had other concerns. The tire took priority. You took priority, she said. Then she seemed to hear how that landed and adjusted slightly. I mean the situation. The person who stopped. You took priority over the annoyance. He nodded. Let her have the correction. Dinner ended the way good dinners end when you're not watching the clock. Not with a bang, but with the mild surprise that 2 hours have passed and you haven't noticed. Outside on the sidewalk, the night had gone cool. The kind of fall cool that wasn't cold yet, but was making a clear case for itself. Victoria stood with her hands in the pockets of her blazer, and Ethan stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, and they both looked at the street for a moment because looking at each other felt like it required a transition. Thank you, she said, for stopping. You would have been fine. I would have been waiting on a shoulder for 90 minutes, she said. That's not the same as fine. Fair enough. She looked at him. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. If we hadn't been each other's blind date, she said, if you'd fixed the tire and we'd talked and then gone our separate ways, would you have wanted to see me again? It was a direct question. He appreciated direct questions. They were rarer than they should be. He didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer felt like something worth saying correctly. Yeah, he said. I would have. She nodded slowly, looking at the street. I was hoping you'd say that. Because? She turned to look at him. Because you didn't know you were supposed to be interested in me. You had no context, no setup. A pause. You just stopped because someone was stuck. That's... She seemed to be searching for the word. That's a different kind of person than I usually meet. You meet a lot of people who wouldn't stop? I meet a lot of people who calculate whether stopping is worth it first. He thought about that, about what it said about the world she moved through, about the particular kind of loneliness that came with always being the most powerful person in the room. For what it's worth, he said, I wasn't calculating anything. It was just a flat tire. I know, she said. That's what I mean. The street was quiet around them. A cab moved past. Somewhere down the block, someone was laughing. You should probably get home, he said. The spare, don't push it. I know. She didn't move immediately. This was not what I expected tonight to be. Me either. It was better. He looked at her. Yeah, it was. She pulled out her phone and held it out. The move was clean. No performance, no coyness, just the practical gesture of a woman who knew what she wanted and acted accordingly. Your number, in case there's another tire emergency. He looked at the phone, then at her. In case, he agreed and typed his number in. She texted him immediately so he'd have hers. He heard his phone buzz in his pocket. "Drive carefully," he said. "You too." She started toward the silver Mercedes, which was waiting at the curb. She'd paid for parking rather than drive the spare through a lot, which told him everything about how she thought. At the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Ethan." "Yeah." "Tell your sister she did okay." He watched her get into the car, watched the Mercedes ease out into traffic, hazard lights gone, moving smooth and steady on its spare tire at a carefully appropriate speed. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the fall night air. His phone buzzed again. He pulled it out. "Dana." "How did it go?" He looked at the message for a moment, then he typed back, "I'll tell you later. Drive safe, Sophie, in the tub by 8. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked back to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for 30 seconds before starting the engine, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting with the strange, specific fullness of an evening that had gone entirely wrong and turned out to be one of the better ones he could remember. He started the truck. He drove home. Sophie was asleep when he got back to Dana's, crashed out on the couch, with Gerald the elephant tucked under one arm and a blanket that she'd clearly negotiated herself piled on top of her. Dana was in the kitchen with a cup of tea, waiting with the elaborate casualness of someone who had been counting the minutes. "She went out about an hour ago," Dana said, nodding at Sophie. "Fought it hard. I told her you'd be home by 10, and she said, 'He'll be early if it goes bad.'" A pause. "It's 9:47. "She's not wrong," he said. Dana set down her tea. "It wasn't terrible, was it?" He picked Sophie up carefully. She was heavier than she looked, the way sleeping children always were, her full weight trusting him completely. Gerald dangled from her fist. He got her settled against his shoulder. "She's impressive," he said. "Victoria." Dana's entire face changed. "Yeah?" "Yeah." He shifted Sophie's weight, her head heavy and warm against his neck. "You did okay, Dana." His sister watched him carry his daughter toward the door, and he could feel her trying not to grin too hard. "Ethan," he paused. "She texted me," Dana said. "Victoria, like 20 minutes ago. She said," and I quote, "Your brother is the most interesting person I've met in years. Whatever you did, don't stop doing it." He stood in the doorway with his sleeping daughter on his shoulder and the fall night at his back. "Night, Donna," he said. He carried Sophie to the truck, buckled her in carefully, Gerald secured in the seat beside her. He drove home through the quiet Wilmington streets, past the dark storefronts and the amber streetlights, and the kind of ordinary neighborhood night that his daughter would someday remember as the backdrop of her childhood. He didn't know what came next. He had her number in his phone. She had his. The dinner had been strange and accidental and real in a way that most planned things weren't. He pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, sat for a moment in the dark. Then he got out, unbuckled Sophie, and carried her inside. One night at a time. That was all it ever was. One ordinary, unpredictable, occasionally beautiful night at a time. The text came on Sunday morning while Ethan was under the chassis of a 2019 Ford F-150 with a stripped oil drain plug and a customer who had, apparently, been ignoring the problem for 6 months. His phone was on the workbench. He heard it buzz twice in quick succession, which was unusual. Most people who contacted him during the weekend were either Dana or a customer whose car situation had become urgent enough to interrupt their Saturday morning. He finished what he was doing, slid out from under the truck on the creeper, and reached for the phone with a hand he'd mostly wiped clean on a shop rag. 2 texts. Both from the number he'd saved Friday night with no name yet, just the area code and a note to himself that said Victoria/spare tire. The first message said, "The regular tire is fixed. Took it in this morning." The mechanic asked how a screw that size got embedded at that angle, and I had no good answer. The second said, "Also, thank you again, for Friday." It was a strange evening, strange good. He read them twice, then he set the phone down, went back under the truck, finished extracting the stripped plug with a tool his father had given him that he'd never found a replacement for, and came back out. He wiped his hands properly this time and typed back, "Glad the tire's sorted." Strange good is usually better than the alternative. She responded inside of 2 minutes. In my experience, strange good is rare. I'm not sure I've had many evenings that qualify. He looked at the message for a moment. Then you've been doing Friday nights wrong, he typed. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Then, that's entirely possible. I'm working on it. He smiled at his phone in the empty shop on a Sunday morning, which was not something he'd planned for this decade. They didn't go on a second date immediately. That wasn't how it happened. What happened was slower and more accidental than that, which was probably why it worked. She texted on Tuesday afternoon to ask whether Coles Auto did fleet maintenance contracts, because Hale Logistics ran a pool of 8 company vehicles, and her current service provider had been progressively worse for the past year. He told her he'd handled fleet accounts before, and to bring one of the vehicles in for an assessment. She sent Marcus instead. Her assistant, a lean, efficient man in his mid-30s who arrived on time, asked precise questions, took detailed notes, and told Ethan at the end of the visit that he would forward the assessment request to Ms. Hale's operations team. "You work for her directly?" Ethan asked as Marcus was heading out. "For 8 years, Marcus said. He paused at the door with the air of someone who had one more thing to say and was deciding whether to say it. She doesn't talk about people, as a rule. People she meets. She mentioned Friday 3 times this week. He said it neutrally, the way a person delivers information without an editorial. Then he left. Ethan stood in his shop doorway and watched Marcus's car pull out of the lot. His head mechanic, a 54-year-old named Ray, who had worked for him for 6 years and spoke exclusively in observations and complaints, appeared at his elbow. "Fleet account?" Ray asked. "Maybe. 8 vehicles?" That's what he said. Ray considered this. "That's good business." "It is." "You're not thinking about the business," Ray said. "I'm thinking about the business," Ethan said. Ray walked back inside without responding, which was his standard way of indicating he didn't believe you but wasn't going to argue about it. Victoria called the shop on Thursday. Not Marcus, Victoria herself, on the main line, at 10 in the morning, which meant she was between meetings or making time in a schedule that didn't typically make time. "I wanted to follow up on the fleet assessment," she said when he answered. "Marcus says you'd be a good fit." "Marcus seems thorough. He's the best person I've ever hired." A pause. "I also wanted to ask, and you can say no, if Sophie would want to go to the aquarium this weekend. There's a Saturday event for families. I have 2 tickets and I was planning to go alone, which is a beat. I was going to say fine, but it's a family event and I don't have a family, so..." He let that sit for a second, not to make her uncomfortable, just to hear what was actually being said beneath the practical framing. "You're asking us to the aquarium," he said. "I am. If that's strange, forget I said it." "It's not strange." So he glanced toward the shop floor where Ray was pretending not to listen. "Sophie's been asking about the aquarium for 2 months. Something about seahorses. The new seahorse exhibit opened 3 weeks ago. How do you know about the seahorse exhibit?" "I looked it up," she said. "After you mentioned she was 7, 7-year-olds tend to have strong feelings about seahorses." He leaned against the counter. "You researched my daughter's age group." "I did my due diligence." She said it without embarrassment. "Is that weird?" "It's very CEO of you." "I'm going to take that as a compliment." "It was," he said. "Saturday works. She'll want to leave early to see the seahorses before it gets crowded." "I'll meet you there at 9. After he hung up, Ray appeared again with a socket wrench he was wiping down for no particular reason. "Aquarium," he said. "Fleet meeting," Ethan said. "Sure," Ray said. Sophie met Victoria at 9:03 on a Saturday morning in the lobby of the Wilmington Marine Center, wearing a shirt with a cartoon octopus on it that she had specifically selected the night before, and she shook Victoria's hand with the solemnity of someone who had been told that handshakes were important. "My dad says you're in business," Sophie announced. "I am," Victoria said, crouching to Sophie's level without making a production of it. "Supply chain logistics." "What's that?" "It means I help make sure that things that need to get somewhere actually get there." Sophie considered this. "Like Amazon?" "Sort of. More for companies than for people." "Oh." Sophie looked at her father. She has a good handshake, she told him. I'll take that, Victoria said. The seahorse exhibit was everything Sophie had built it up to be in her head, which was a minor miracle because 7-year-olds tend to build things up in ways that reality can rarely match. The seahorses moved the way they always did, small and improbably elegant, with that strange vertical drift that looked less like swimming and more like hovering. Sophie pressed both hands flat against the glass and watched them with the total absorption of someone for whom nothing else existed in that moment. Victoria stood beside her and watched too, not performing interest, just watching. They're the only ones where the dads carry the babies, Sophie said. The male seahorses, Dad told me. He's right, Victoria said. The females deposit the eggs and the males carry them until they hatch. That's weird, Sophie said. Or efficient, Victoria said, depending on how you look at it. Sophie turned to look at her with an expression that was genuinely evaluating something. Are you his girlfriend? Ethan, who had been standing slightly behind them pretending to read an informational placard about marine biology, felt the air change. Victoria didn't flinch. We're friends, she said. We just met. How? His truck was behind my car when my tire went flat. Sophie turned this over. He fixed it? He did. Sophie looked back at the seahorses. He fixes everything, she said matter-of-factly, the way you say something that is simply obvious and requires no elaboration. Something moved across Victoria's face that she quickly rearranged into neutral. But Ethan had seen it. He was getting better at seeing the small things she didn't mean to show. They spent 3 hours at the aquarium. Sophie demanded they see the shark tank twice and had strong opinions about the jellyfish. They looked like fancy plastic bags, and fell into a focused silence at the Ray Touch pool that lasted 8 minutes and felt almost meditative. At some point, without anyone deciding it, Victoria began walking alongside Ethan while Sophie ran ahead to the next exhibit. The conversations they had were small and intermittent, observations about the exhibits, about Sophie's running commentary, about nothing in particular, the kind of conversation that isn't really about the words, and both people know it. She's remarkable, Victoria said at one point. She's a lot, he said. The two things are related. You're good with her. I've had 4 years of intensive practice. It shows. She paused, watching Sophie explain something to a volunteer near the Ray tank. She's not afraid of people. That takes... You have to model that for a kid. Show them that people are worth approaching. He looked at her sideways. You didn't learn that growing up? She was quiet for a beat. Not particularly, she said, which was all she offered, and he didn't push. Status. The fleet contract came through the following Wednesday. 8 vehicles, quarterly service, priority scheduling. Ray, who heard the news, simply said, "Good business," and went back to what he was doing. The fleet brought Victoria's vehicles into the shop on a rotation. It also, in the natural course of things, occasionally brought Victoria herself, stopping in on her lunch break to check on a vehicle that had been flagged, or dropping off her personal car when it needed something, or once, purely by coincidence, arriving at the same time as a difficult customer who was arguing loudly that his brake pads couldn't possibly need replacing. Ethan was dealing with that customer, a man named Dwight, who drove a lifted pickup and had opinions, when Victoria walked in. She sat in the waiting area with her laptop and worked with the specific, contained focus of someone who had learned to work everywhere. She didn't look up during the conversation. She didn't need to. But after Dwight left, still dissatisfied but in possession of new brake pads he'd eventually be grateful for, she said, without looking up from her screen, "You were very patient with him. Part of the job." He was wrong. He was, but he needed to feel like he'd been heard before he could hear anything else. He sat on the edge of the waiting area counter. People are like that a lot. She looked up at him over the top of her laptop. Not in my boardroom. In your boardroom, they just don't say it out loud. She considered that. Then she closed the laptop halfway. Is that what you think happens in executive meetings? People wanting to feel heard? Doesn't it? She opened her mouth, closed it. More than I account for, she admitted. You're good at the strategy part, he said. You seem less interested in the human part. That's not entirely unfair. I'm not criticizing, he said. Just, you notice things. About people. About Sophie, about the aquarium, about what was actually going on with Dwight just now. You see it. You just don't always know what to do with it. She looked at him steadily. And you do? Not always, but I've had a 7-year-old teaching me for 4 years. She doesn't let you get away with ignoring the human part. Victoria was quiet. Outside, Ray started an engine and let it idle, listening to the way it breathed. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon in a garage that smelled like oil and coffee and concrete. Can I tell you something? Victoria said. Yeah. I haven't had a conversation that wasn't about work or logistics or some kind of professional agenda in, she paused, seemed to be actually calculating. A long time, long enough that I'd stopped noticing. What made you notice? Friday, she said. On the highway. You talked to me like I was just a person, not a client, not a contact, not a CEO, just, she stopped, like I was just a person with a flat tire. He looked at her. You were just a person with a flat tire. I know. She said it softly. It was a relief. That landed somewhere in the space between them and stayed there. He didn't try to fill it with anything. October in Wilmington was a particular kind of beautiful that residents tended to undersell when describing it to people from elsewhere. The heat broke genuinely in October, not the false breaks of late August that reversed themselves within a week. The light came in lower, more golden, and the live oaks that lined the older neighborhoods went through their own slow version of the season, not the dramatic color explosions of New England, but something quieter and more southern, a gradual loosening. Ethan noticed October the way he noticed most things in Wilmington, with the half-conscious appreciation of someone who'd grown up here and knew what it meant without having to think about it. Victoria, who'd moved to Wilmington 4 years ago from Chicago, was still in the phase of experiencing the seasons like something she could stand back and observe. He found this out one evening when she stopped by the shop near closing time with his invoice for the fleet contract, which she could have emailed, and they both knew it. And they ended up standing in the parking lot as the sky went gold and talking for 45 minutes about nothing in particular. Chicago Falls are impressive, she said. All the drama. Here it's more quiet, he said. I was going to say understated. Same thing. I like it, she said. I didn't expect to like it this much. You expected to like Chicago better. I expected to like somewhere with a bigger financial district. She said it plainly. I moved here for a strategic reason. Lower operating costs, a growing port infrastructure, proximity to the interstate network. It wasn't a lifestyle choice. And then it became one. Slowly. She looked at the trees at the edge of the lot. Very slowly. He leaned against the side of his truck. The lot was empty now, the shop locked up, the day finished. What kept you here once the strategic reason stopped mattering? It never stopped mattering. Business is still the reason. A pause. But I don't go home wishing I was somewhere else anymore. That happened somewhere in year 2, and I didn't notice until year 3. Sophie did that for me too, he said. I stayed because of her, and then I stopped wanting to leave because of Wilmington. What would you have done otherwise, if not here? He thought about it. There's a restoration shop in Asheville that was looking for a master technician about 4 years ago. Vintage cars, high-end work. The pay would have been better. But Sophie was already in kindergarten and she had a best friend named Mia, and she'd learned the names of every librarian in her branch library. He looked at the sky. You don't move someone out of that for better pay. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I made every career decision based on what was best for the company, she said. I moved when the company needed it. I worked the hours the company needed. I gave up things the company required. She said it without self-pity, just observation. I'm 30 years old and my most significant relationship is with my quarterly earnings report. That's not true, he said. It's mostly true. Marcus, he said, the way you talk about him, that's not just professional. She tilted her head slightly. He's my employee. He's also someone you trust. You don't have many of those. She looked at him. You've met me twice. 3 times, he said. Aquarium. 3 times, she conceded. You give a lot away in how you talk about people, he said. You're careful with most of them. Marcus, you're not careful with. Sophie, you weren't careful with. Me. He paused. You're careful with me, but less than you planned to be. The parking lot was very quiet. Somewhere down the street, someone's dog was having an opinion about something. That's uncomfortably accurate, she said. Sorry. Don't be. She looked at him with the expression he was starting to recognize, the one where she was recalibrating, adjusting her internal read of the situation. You're a mechanic who reads people better than most executives I know. My dad said cars and people run the same way, he said. They tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen. And what am I telling you? He looked at her honestly. That you're tired, he said. Not sleep tired, just tired of operating at that level of alone. She didn't answer for a moment. The golden light was almost gone now, the sky moving toward the deep blue of early evening. What do you do, she said quietly, when you've been alone long enough that you've forgotten how not to be? It wasn't a rhetorical question. She was actually asking. He thought about it. About the first year after his marriage ended, when Sophie was 3 and he was running on coffee, and the specific survival instinct of a man who couldn't afford to fall apart. About the slow, unglamorous process of building something functional out of what was left. You do it wrong a lot, he said, and then you do it a little less wrong, and after a while you can't remember what the wrong felt like. She looked at him for a long moment. That's not very reassuring. No, he said, but it's true. She almost smiled. Not quite. I think I prefer true to reassuring. I know you do, he said. That's one of the things that makes you easy to talk to. She looked slightly surprised at that, like she'd been called easy to talk to before but hadn't believed it, and wasn't entirely sure she believed it now, but was letting the possibility exist. It's late, she said finally. It is. Sophie's at Dana's? Soccer practice until 6:30, then Dana's for dinner. I pick her up at 8. You have 2 hours. I was going to eat and watch something I'll fall asleep in the middle of, he said. Very exciting Friday. I'm 32 with a kid in a shop. I've made peace with Friday nights. She looked at him. He looked at her. The evening had the particular quality of a moment that had a fork in it, where you could go one way or the other and both options were real and neither of them was nothing. There's a diner on 3rd Street, she said. Decent coffee. Open late. I know it. I haven't eaten since noon, she said, because I was in back-to-back meetings and then a fleet invoice required personal delivery. He pushed off the side of the truck. A diner sounds fine. It's not a date, she said. For the record. Noted, he said. I'm just clarifying. I heard you. Okay. She looked down at her keys. I'll meet you there. She drove ahead of him. He followed 3 car lengths back, watching the silver Mercedes move through the October evening, careful and steady on its actual tires, in no particular hurry. It wasn't a date. They both knew that. It was 2 people who were tired and hungry and had found, against the odds of their respective lives, that the other person was someone worth being tired and hungry in front of. Sometimes that was more honest than a date anyway. They sat in a corner booth at the diner on 3rd Street for an hour and 40 minutes. They ordered coffee and eggs and something with toast that neither of them fully paid attention to, and they talked the way people talk when they stop performing and start existing in the same space. She told him about the company's first year, things she hadn't told him at Bricks, more specific, more raw. A vendor who had disappeared with a deposit and left her scrambling for 3 weeks. A client meeting where she'd shown up with the flu and made the presentation anyway because there was no one else who could, and had gotten the contract and driven home after and sat in her car for 20 minutes because she hadn't had anyone to call. He told her about the night Sophie was 4 and ran a fever of 103, and he'd called his mother in a panic at 2 in the morning because he was terrified and didn't know what he was doing, and his mother had talked him through it with the calm of someone who had done it before and come out the other side. Did the fever break? Victoria asked. By morning, she woke up demanding pancakes. He turned his coffee cup on the table. I made the worst pancakes of my life because my hands were still shaking. She ate them anyway? She said they were delicious. He looked at the cup. She was being polite. She was 4 and she was being polite to me because she could tell I needed it. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She's going to be extraordinary, she said. She already is. The diner was nearly empty. The cook could be heard in the back, dealing with something involving a pan. The ceiling light above their booth hummed slightly, just enough to be noticed if you were listening. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad you stopped." He knew she meant the highway. He knew she also meant more than that. "Me too," he said. Outside, Wilmington was settling into its Friday night. The live oaks on 3rd Street held their ground in the dark. The October air was the temperature of something you couldn't name but recognized. The specific cool that meant things were changing at a pace slow enough to live with. Inside the diner, 2 people sat across from each other with empty coffee cups and no particular reason to leave yet, and didn't. November came in the way it did in Wilmington, not with the dramatic arrival of colder climates, not with the first snowfall or the last leaf dropping in some final cinematic gesture, but quietly, almost apologetically, the way a season does when it knows it's not the main attraction. The mornings got sharp. The evenings shortened. The live oaks kept most of their leaves because they always did, which was the thing about this part of North Carolina that still caught Victoria off guard. The persistence of green, even in the months that were supposed to let go of it. She and Ethan had been doing whatever they were doing for 6 weeks by the time the first real tension appeared between them. 6 weeks of dinners that weren't dates and conversations that went longer than planned and texts that happened naturally in the middle of ordinary days. Him sending a photo of a particularly mangled exhaust system with the caption, "Someone's having a worse day than you," her sending back a photo of her 4th coffee of the morning with no caption at all, which communicated exactly what it needed to. 6 weeks of something that had no official name, which suited both of them fine until it didn't. The fleet contract was running well. Ray had taken over most of the day-to-day interaction with Marcus on vehicle scheduling, which freed Ethan from the logistical minutiae and left him with the slightly uncomfortable clarity that his professional reasons for regular contact with Victoria Hale had become secondary to the other reasons. He was aware of this. He suspected she was too. The evening it shifted was a Tuesday, which was unremarkable except that Victoria had called him at 7:15 while he was helping Sophie with a math worksheet. Not a crisis, just called, the way you call someone when they come to mind and you stop second-guessing whether to, and he'd stepped into the kitchen to talk while Sophie worked at the dining table with a pencil and the focused ferocity she brought to everything she found difficult. "Bad day?" he asked, because he could hear it in the first 3 words. "Long day," she said. "I had a board meeting. 2 of my investors want to push an acquisition I don't want, and they're applying pressure in ways that are subtle enough to be hard to address directly." "What do they want to acquire?" "A mid-size freight company in Ohio. It would expand our capacity significantly. On paper, it makes sense." A pause. "In practice, I've seen their books. The debt structure is bad and their driver turnover rate is catastrophic. We'd be inheriting problems that would take 3 years and significant capital to fix." "And they know that?" "They know it. They want the market share quickly. The long-term problems are, in their view, someone else's concern." "Someone else meaning you." "Someone else meaning me." Another pause, shorter. "I'm going to fight it. I've been fighting it for 2 months. Tonight they made it personal." He leaned against the kitchen counter. In the other room, Sophie erased something vigorously. "How personal?" "One of them, Caldwell, he's been on my board since year 2, suggested in the meeting that I might be experiencing decision fatigue." Her voice was controlled but only just. "That I might benefit from perspective." "He said that to you in a meeting, in front of 4 other people." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He knew the type, not from boardrooms, but from the version that appeared in auto shops. The customer who questioned your read not because they had better information, but because accepting your authority cost them something they weren't willing to spend. "What did you say?" "I said I would take his input under advisement." A short exhale. "Which was the most professional version of what I actually wanted to say." "Which was?" "Nothing printable." He almost laughed. Almost. "What are you going to do?" "What I always do. Work through it, document my position, make the case until it's airtight." She was quiet for a beat. "I'm not calling because I need a strategy. She stopped, and he recognized the particular hesitation of someone catching themselves doing something unfamiliar. "I wanted to hear a voice that wasn't connected to any of it." He stood in his kitchen with the Tuesday night noise of his house around him. Sophie's pencil, the hum of the refrigerator, a car moving past outside, and felt the weight of that sentence. Not because it was dramatic, because it was honest in the way that only came out when someone was too tired to perform. "It's going to be a fight," he said, "but you already know you're right about the acquisition." "I know I'm right." "Then fight it like you know you're right, not like you're trying to prove it." Silence. Then, "That's the distinction, isn't it?" "Usually?" She was quiet another moment. In the background of her end, he could hear a city, traffic, distance, the ambient sound of someone sitting in a high-rise office with the window cracked. "How's Sophie?" "Losing a battle with fractions." "Fractions are genuinely hard. People pretend they're not." "I'll tell her a CEO said so. It'll help." Victoria made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost. Go help her. I've taken enough of your evening." "You haven't," he said, and meant it in the specific way that people mean things they say simply, without architecture. There was a pause on her end. He could feel her with it, sitting with the plainness of those two words and what they suggested about what was happening between them. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "I'm not good at this," she said. "At whatever this is, I want you to know that going in, I don't do it well, and I do it worse when it matters." "I know," he said. "You don't mind?" "I'm not great at it either." He looked at the kitchen floor. "We can be bad at it together and see what happens." A short pause. "That's a terrible pitch." "I know." "Okay," she said softly. "Good night." "Night, Victoria." He went back to the dining room. Sophie looked up from her worksheet with the expression of someone who had heard exactly nothing and was going to ask about it later. "Fractions?" he said. "They don't make sense," she said. "3/4 of what? What is the 4? Why is it on the bottom?" He sat down beside her. "Let me show you something." Mbese. 2 weeks later on a Saturday, Victoria came to the shop for the first time not as a client. She called ahead. She always called ahead. It was one of the things about her that was so deeply organized it was almost charming, and asked if she could stop by in the afternoon. She said she had nothing particular in mind, which was the most particular thing she could have said, because Victoria Hale did not have afternoons without purpose. She manufactured purpose. She was constitutionally incapable of the aimless Saturday. He said come by any time after 2. She arrived at 2:14. The shop was quiet in the way Saturday afternoons were quiet. Ray had left at noon, the bay doors were half open, and the only car inside was a vintage 1967 Mustang that belonged to a retired high school principal named George, who brought it in every fall for its seasonal going over. Ethan was cleaning a carburetor at the workbench when Victoria walked in. She stopped just inside the bay door and looked around. He let her look. The shop was not a beautiful space in any conventional sense. It was concrete and steel and oil stains and fluorescent light, organized with the particular logic of a man who knew where everything was and resented when things weren't where they were. The walls had the residue of 30 years of repairs. Not this shop specifically, his father's shop first, and the habits Ethan had inherited along with the tools. The Mustang in the center of the bay was the most visually striking thing in the room. Its red paint faded to something warmer and more honest than the original. "This is where you live," Victoria said. "Second home," he said. "What's the other one?" "The actual home." She walked further in, hands in the pockets of her jacket, a weekend jacket, not a blazer, which he'd noticed she'd started wearing on the days she wasn't in meetings. The small shifts in her Saturday presentation had become, without his planning it, something he paid attention to. "Whose car?" she asked, stopping beside the Mustang. "George Alderman, retired teacher. He's had this car longer than I've been alive." She walked around the front of it, taking it in. "It's beautiful." "It is." "Does it run?" "Like a dream when it's right. Right now, the carburetor's being difficult." He held up the part in question. "What does that do?" "Mixes the air and fuel before it goes into the engine. If the ratio's off, the car runs rough. Too much fuel, too little air, too much air, all different problems." She looked at the carburetor, then at him. "And you can tell the difference by looking at it?" "By looking, by smell, by the way the engine sounded when he drove it in." He set it down on the bench. You learn to read the symptoms. She was watching him in the way she sometimes did, not obviously, just with that particular quality of attention that meant something was being filed somewhere in that organized, efficient mind. "You love this," she said. Not a question. "Yeah. It's different when you see it here." She looked around the shop again. "At the diner, you talk about it like a job. Here you're—" She tilted her head. "You're at home." He thought about arguing with that and decided it wasn't worth it because she was right. "Sophie comes here sometimes," he said. "After school, when I can't get coverage for pickup, she does homework at that bench." He nodded toward the back. "She's made friends with every car that's come through here. She names them." Victoria looked at the bench. There was a small wooden stool, a cup full of colored pencils, and a stack of books with a dolphin bookmark sticking out of the top one. Small, persistent evidence of a child's presence in a working world. "She named the Mustang?" Victoria asked. "Gerald Jr.," he said. Victoria turned to look at him. "After the elephant." She said the color was the same. Something crossed Victoria's face, something warm and a little unguarded. She caught it quickly, but not before he'd seen it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You usually just ask." This one feels different. She was looking at the workbench rather than at him. "What happened with Sophie's mother?" He'd known it would come eventually. He'd been waiting for it without exactly knowing he was waiting. "She left," he said. "When Sophie was 3. Victoria looked up. It wasn't dramatic," he said. "There was no fight, no catastrophic event. She came to me one evening and said she wasn't happy and hadn't been for a long time and she needed to go." He picked up a shop rag and turned it over in his hands. "I think she'd been unhappy for a while, and I hadn't been paying enough attention to notice. That's on me too. You were raising a child. So was she. She just—" He stopped. Some people figure out too late what they actually want from their life. She figured it out at 28. It was hard. It was also honest. "Do you hear from her?" "Occasionally. Cards for Sophie's birthday. She's in Portland now. She's remarried." He set the rag down. "Sophie knows she exists. She doesn't ask about her much. When she does, I tell her the truth in the kindest version I can." Victoria was quiet. "You don't sound angry." "I was angry," he said. "For about a year, I was very angry. And then Sophie said something to me one morning. She was 4, she'd just woken up. She said, "Daddy, you make good pancakes." And I thought— He shook his head. "I thought, this is actually my life. Not the life I planned. My actual life. And it's not that bad." Victoria was still looking at him. "The pancakes you made with shaking hands," she said quietly. "Same ones." He met her eyes. "I got better at them." The shop was very quiet. Outside, a car moved past on the street. Wind came through the half-open bay door, bringing the November air with it, cool and carrying the distant smell of leaves. "My father left when I was 9, Victoria said. She said it the way you say something that has been prepared for a long time, but never quite delivered, careful and fast at the same time. "My mother ran everything after that. She was good at running things, not great at being warm while she did it." She paused. "I think I learned from her that competence was the substitute, that if you were good enough at everything that mattered, the things that didn't could be managed." "Things that didn't," he said. "Like what?" "Like needing people." She said it flatly. "Like wanting company, like the fact that you can run a company successfully for 6 years and come home to an empty apartment every night and call that a life." He looked at her. She was looking at the Mustang, at the faded red paint and the chrome that George polished faithfully, even though it wasn't perfect anymore. "You don't have to manage it," he said. "With me. Whatever it is, you don't have to manage it." She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know how to do that," she said. Not as an excuse, as a fact stated plainly, the way she stated all facts. I don't have the muscle for it. Years of doing something one way doesn't just—" "I know," he said. "I'll do it wrong." "Probably. That doesn't scare you." "I've been doing it wrong for a while," he said. "With Sophie, with the shop, with everything. Doing it wrong doesn't mean stopping. She finally looked at him. The Saturday afternoon light came through the bay door at an angle and landed on the side of her face, and she looked, for a moment, like the version of herself she didn't show the boardroom. Not managed, not polished, not performing competence. Just a person standing in a garage, out of her depth in a way that was specific and human and nothing to be ashamed of. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah, I think I'm closer to this than I planned to be." He didn't ask her to define this. He knew what she meant. He'd known for a while. "Me too," he said. She nodded once, a small sharp nod that meant she was processing something. Then she said, "Show me how the carburetor works." He looked at her. "Seriously? I want to understand what you're doing when I'm not here." She moved to the workbench. "Show me." He showed her. He laid out the parts, explained the function of each one, walked her through the fuel-air ratio and what happened when it was wrong. She asked questions, sharp, specific questions, the kind that came from someone who had learned to understand systems, and he answered them, and she listened the way she listened to everything, completely, with a focus that felt like its own form of generosity. They were still at the workbench an hour later when his phone buzzed. Dana, confirming she was bringing Sophie by at 5. Victoria looked at the time on her phone. "I should go." "You don't have to." "Sophie's coming." "She likes you," he said. "She told me Gerald Jr. was named for your car. That's basically a citation of significance in her world." Victoria smiled at that. A real one, not the managed kind. It did something to her face that he'd stopped being able to look at casually. "Next time," she said. "I'll stay for Sophie." "Next time," he said. She gathered her jacket. At the bay door, she stopped. She did this sometimes, stopped at exits, as if she needed a moment before re-entering the outside world. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah. I'm not going to say I'm good at this. I know, but I don't want to stop." He looked at her across the width of the shop, beside the Mustang. George Alderman had loved for 30 years, with the November air coming in at the door, and the smell of oil and metal, and something that was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to feel like something worth building. "Good," he said. 3 days later, the acquisition fight broke open in a way that Victoria had not anticipated, and Ethan heard about it at 11 at night from a text that said simply, "Caldwell called an emergency board meeting. They have the votes. I need to think." He called instead of texting back. She answered on the second ring. "Tell me what happened," he said. She told him. The details were corporate and specific, but the shape was familiar. A person who had built something carefully over years, being told that the thing they built was not entirely theirs to protect. Caldwell had gathered 2 other board members and made a formal motion to override Victoria's recommendation on the Ohio acquisition. They had the numerical votes. The motion would pass unless she could make a case compelling enough to shift at least one. "Can you?" he asked. "The data is on my side." She sounded tired in a way she didn't usually let come through. But data doesn't always win when the people reading it want a different answer. "Who's the one you can move?" "What?" "You said you need 1 vote. Which one is movable?" A pause. "Patterson," she said. "Eleanor Patterson. She's cautious by nature. If I can make the risk case clearly enough, then make it to her directly," he said. "Not in the meeting. Before. 1 conversation, 1 person." "That's..." She stopped. "That's actually... Yes. That's the right approach." "You already knew that." "I was too close to it to see it." A short silence. "You do that." "Do what?" "Move me far enough back to see it." She said it quietly, like she was discovering the fact as she stated it. "I don't have many people who do that." He didn't say anything to that. He let it be what it was. "It's late," she said. "You have the shop tomorrow." "I do." "How's George's Mustang?" He almost smiled. "Carburetor's back in. She runs clean." "Good." A pause. "Ethan?" "Yeah. Thank you." She said it simply, without the executive layer over it. Just the word, from the person underneath. Get some sleep, he said. Talk to Patterson tomorrow. I will. He stayed on the line until he heard her breathing settle. Not sleep, just quiet. Then she said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and he set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling of his bedroom in the dark. Down the hall, Sophie was asleep with Gerald under her arm and the nightlight making a soft triangle on the wall. The house was quiet. November moved outside the windows. He lay there for a while, not sleeping, thinking about the particular shape of what was happening, the way two people could spend weeks in the careful middle distance and then find, in the small, honest moments, that the distance had been closing all along. He wasn't afraid of it. He'd been afraid of other things, of failing Sophie, of the shop not making it, of all the ordinary disasters that came with an ordinary life. This didn't feel like something to be afraid of. It felt like something to be careful with, which was different. He was careful with engines. He was careful with his daughter. He was learning to be careful with this. He closed his eyes. The house settled around him, the way houses did at night. The small sounds of wood and wind and the distant street making the particular music of a life that was, for all its imperfections, genuinely his. He thought about Victoria in her high-rise apartment, probably still at her desk, probably still working, the city outside her window and the numbers on her screen and the fight still ahead of her in the morning. He thought about her standing in the shop in her weekend jacket, asking about the carburetor. He thought about what she'd said. I don't want to stop. Neither did he. That was enough. For tonight, that was exactly enough. Eleanor Patterson said yes. Not in the meeting, in a 40-minute conversation over coffee in her downtown office the morning before the board convened, where Victoria laid out the risk analysis on the Ohio acquisition with the precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this conversation for 72 hours straight. Patterson was 61, had served on 4 boards in her career, and had the particular quality of someone who respected competence enough to be moved by it when it was genuine. She listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, and at the end she said, "You're right about the debt structure. I'll vote with you." The motion failed. Caldwell sat through it with the expression of a man recalculating something. Victoria texted Ethan from the parking garage afterward. Patterson, 1 word. He sent back a single thumbs up, which she later told him was the most restrained celebratory response she'd ever received, and he said he was at work and covered in transmission fluid, so she could manage her expectations. She called him that evening, and they talked for an hour, and somewhere in the middle of it, the conversation shifted from the acquisition fight to something else. The way it did now, moving between subjects without friction, without either of them managing the transition. She said she'd eaten actual dinner for the first time in 4 days. He said that was a low bar. She said she was aware of that. He said good. He didn't tell her that he'd been checking his phone all day waiting to hear how the vote went. He didn't need to. She knew. That was becoming one of the things about them. The things that didn't need to be said because they'd already been understood. December arrived, and with it, the particular organized chaos that descended on Ethan Cole every year around this time. The shop got busier as people remembered all the maintenance they'd deferred. The weather turned unreliable enough to make ignoring vehicle problems actually dangerous. And Sophie entered the sustained campaign of excitement and negotiation that was her annual approach to the holiday season. She wants a telescope, Ethan told Victoria. They were in his kitchen on a Thursday evening, which had become a semi-regular thing. Victoria would finish work and drive to his house instead of her apartment, and they would make dinner or eat whatever was available, and Sophie would do homework or show Victoria things on the floor of the living room with the particular urgency of a child who had decided someone was worth impressing. A good one? Victoria asked. She was at the kitchen counter eating leftover soup while he finished the dishes, which was a domestic arrangement they had arrived at without discussing. She doesn't know the difference yet, but I want to get her something she won't outgrow in a year. There's a 12-inch Dobsonian reflector that's appropriate for beginners, but has enough aperture to actually see detail on Jupiter's moons. She said it completely naturally, and then seemed to hear herself. I looked into telescopes a while back. He turned from the sink. You looked into telescopes. I like to be useful. You looked into telescopes for a 7-year-old you'd met twice. She held his gaze steadily. For a 7-year-old I'd met 3 times. The aquarium. He turned back to the sink. He didn't say anything. He was smiling at the dish he was rinsing and had no intention of letting her see it. "I'll send you the link," she said. "Please." In the living room, Sophie was building something with blocks that had progressed well beyond any structural logic and into pure architectural ambition. She called out without looking up. "Victoria, do you have a Christmas tree?" "I don't," Victoria said. "Why not?" A short pause. "I don't usually bother." Sophie looked up from her construction. The expression on her face was the one she deployed when confronted with information that conflicted with her fundamental understanding of how things should work. "A tree is not a bother," she said. "A tree is required." "Required by whom?" "By December." Sophie turned back to her blocks. "You should get one. Dad will help." Ethan, from the kitchen, said nothing. He heard Victoria set down her soup spoon. "Did you coach her?" Victoria asked quietly. "I have no control over what she says. I never have." The sound from the living room was Sophie humming to herself, apparently satisfied that the matter was settled. Victoria looked at the kitchen doorway and then at Ethan, and then she picked up her spoon and went back to her soup and said, "Fine. Saturday." "Fine Saturday what?" "Tree," she said. "If you're both free, yeah." They got the tree on Saturday from a lot on the edge of town run by a man named Burl, who had opinions about every tree on the lot and shared them freely. Sophie interrogated 4 separate trees before selecting a Douglas fir that was slightly crooked at the top, which she identified as a feature rather than a flaw. "It has character," she told Victoria seriously. "That's one word for it," Victoria said. "Dad says things with character are more interesting than things that are perfect." Victoria looked at Ethan, who was loading the tree into the back of his truck with Burl's assistance. "Did he say that about trees specifically?" "He says it about everything." Sophie watched her father wrestle the tree into position with the matter-of-fact affection of someone accustomed to watching him handle things. "He said it about his truck. His truck has a lot of character. He said it about the Mustang, too." Sophie paused. "He said it about people once. I asked him what kind of person he wanted to be friends with, and he said the kind with character." She looked up at Victoria. "I think that means you." Victoria looked down at her, 7 years old, absolutely no awareness of what she'd just said or what it cost to hear. "Your dad is something else," Victoria said. Sophie nodded with the complete confidence of a child who had always known this. "I know," she said. The tree went into Victoria's apartment that afternoon. Ethan carried it up in the elevator, leaving a trail of needles that the building's concierge observed with pained professionalism. Victoria's apartment was on the 14th floor of a building downtown with a view of the Cape Fear River and the kind of interior design that said, "I hired someone who understood my schedule rather than I curated this myself." Everything in it was tasteful and minimal and looked, Sophie observed within 30 seconds of arrival, like a hotel. "You don't have any pictures," Sophie said, standing in the living room. "I have art," Victoria said, gesturing at 2 pieces on the wall. "Art isn't pictures." Sophie turned a slow circle. "We have lots of pictures. Dad is in some, but mostly I'm in them." She looked at Victoria. "Don't you have family?" "Sophie," Ethan said, a quiet note of redirection. "It's okay," Victoria said. She crouched to Sophie's level. She'd gotten comfortable with that, the ease of it. "I have family. I just haven't put the pictures up." Sophie considered this explanation with the thoroughness it deserved. "You should," she said. "It makes a place feel like yours." Then she spotted the window and the river beyond it and moved toward it with the total absorption of a child encountering an excellent view. Ethan looked at Victoria. She was looking at the bare walls. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. "She's rarely wrong," Victoria said. "She's extremely well calibrated for 7. She's had a lot of practice living with someone who says things plainly." He looked at the walls too. "How long have you been here?" 3 years? He nodded. Didn't say what they were both thinking because Sophie had already said it. They spent 2 hours in that apartment, putting up the tree, finding that Victoria owned no ornaments whatsoever, making do with a string of lights Marcus had apparently given her as a housewarming gift 3 years ago and never opened, and a collection of objects Sophie deemed tree-worthy from various surfaces of the apartment. The tree ended up with a decorative bowl from the kitchen shelf, 2 small framed photos Sophie found in a drawer and insisted counted, and every hair tie Victoria owned, which Sophie threaded through branches with the solemnity of an artist. It was ridiculous. It was also the most alive the apartment had looked, probably ever. Victoria stood back and looked at it. "It's terrible," she said. "It has character," Sophie said firmly. Something moved across Victoria's face that she made no effort to control. Ethan saw it. The full version, unmanaged, the expression of a woman standing in her own apartment looking at a crooked tree covered in hair ties and kitchen objects, with a 7-year-old standing beside her like a small, serious curator and feeling something she didn't have a category for yet. He looked away, gave her the moment. January brought cold that was real this time, the kind that meant it even at night. The shop was relentless. 4 weeks of steady work with no slack, Ray and the 2 other guys going hard through every weekday, Ethan coming in early and leaving late, running on the combination of purpose and exhaustion that he'd always found oddly sustainable. Victoria was in the middle of a quarterly audit and a contract renewal with a client whose lawyers had apparently decided that every clause was negotiable. They texted when they could, talked less than November, had dinner twice in January, both times with Sophie, both times at his house where the meal was whatever could be assembled from what was available. It was the most normal thing either of them had done in years. Neither of them commented on this directly, which was itself a form of comment. The night things broke was a Saturday in late January. Ethan had made a mistake, not an unforgivable one, not the kind that ended things, but the kind that came from tiredness and assumption, which were the most common causes of damage in his experience. He had made plans with Dana for Saturday without realizing Victoria had assumed they were spending the afternoon together. Not because she'd said it, because they'd developed the pattern, the unspoken rhythm of Saturday afternoons, and he'd broken it without asking first. He texted her Friday evening. "Dana needs help with something Saturday, taking Sophie. Rain check on the afternoon?" Her response came 40 minutes later. "Of course. No problem." He knew immediately that it was a problem, not because she was being dramatic. Victoria didn't do dramatic, because no problem was how she closed conversations she wasn't finished having. He'd learned to read her in the same way he'd learned to read his daughter, not by what was said, but by the shape of it. He almost called. He didn't. He told himself he'd sort it out later. He spent Saturday at Dana's, helped her shift furniture and decommission a bookshelf, and ate lunch with Sophie and Dana at the kitchen table, and came home that evening to a house that was quiet in the wrong way. He texted Victoria at 6. "How was your day?" 3-word response. "Fine. Worked mostly." He sat with his phone for a minute. Then he called. She answered. She wasn't cold, exactly. Victoria's version of distance wasn't cold, it was contained, a controlled lowering of the temperature by a few degrees that was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. "Tell me what happened," he said. "Nothing happened." "Victoria." A pause. "I had a free afternoon," she said. "I'd planned around it." Another pause, shorter. "I don't do that often, plan personal time. Marcus would tell you I'm physically incapable of it." "But you did." "I did." Her voice was careful. "And then I didn't have a reason to anymore." "I should have asked," he said. "Before I told Dana yes. I should have asked." Silence. "It's not a big deal," she said. "We don't have a formal oops. We have a pattern," he said. "Patterns count. I broke it without checking, and I should have checked." Another silence. Longer. He could feel her deciding something on the other end. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Tell someone they've disappointed me. I just close the door and move on. It's more efficient." "I know," he said. "Do me a favor and don't do that this time." "Why not?" "Because closing the door when something could be fixed is how people end up with bare walls for 3 years. He said it as gently as he could. "I messed up today. Not because I chose Donna, but because I didn't communicate. That's fixable. If you close the door on fixable things, you just end up with a lot of closed doors." The silence this time had a different texture. He waited in it. "I waited," she said finally. "I noticed I was waiting and I hated it. I don't wait. I'm not good at waiting. Nobody is. I especially am not. Her voice had shifted slightly, less contained, more actual. I sat in my apartment and looked at that ridiculous tree for 2 hours. The character tree. It has 17 hair ties and a decorative bowl from my kitchen, and I keep looking at it. A pause. I don't know what that means. I think you know what it means. She was quiet. He heard her exhale slowly. I need you to be straight with me, she said, about what this is. I can't operate in the middle. I'm not built for the middle. What do you mean? I mean, she stopped and he recognized the pause as the one where she was saying something she'd prepared but hadn't expected to actually say. I mean, I'm in it, whatever this is. I'm in it in a way I didn't plan and can't really walk back from. And if you're not, if this is still casual to you or still undefined, or I need to know that, because I will close the door. Not out of anger, just self-preservation. He sat on the edge of his bed in the quiet house, Sophie asleep down the hall with Gerald, the January night pressing against the windows. I'm in it, he said. Ethan, I've been in it since the diner on 3rd Street, he said. Probably before that. I've been careful about it because I have Sophie and I have the shop, and being careful is what I do. But careful and uncommitted aren't the same thing. A pause. I'm sorry about today. I won't do it again. The silence that followed was the quiet kind, not the closed kind. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay. Her voice had come down from the contained place. I believe you. Good. He looked at the window. What are you doing tomorrow? Working? Come for dinner instead. A pause. Sophie has school Monday. She has school Monday. She has Sunday. Come for dinner. He waited. I'll make pancakes. A short silence, and then something happened on her end that he could hear without seeing. The particular release of tension that had no name. The small, audible shift of someone letting something go. Your pancakes better be good, she said. They are now, he said. It took me a while. She came for dinner Sunday. She came for dinner the following Sunday too, and the one after that until Sunday dinners became the kind of thing that needed no invitation. She just appeared, usually around 4, sometimes with something from the bakery on Oleander Drive, and sometimes with nothing except herself, which was what mattered anyway. Sophie accepted this progression with the equanimity of a child whose world had been rearranged before and knew that rearrangement wasn't always bad. She showed Victoria her telescope, the 12-inch Dobsonian reflector that had arrived on Christmas morning in a box so large it took up most of the living room floor, and spent 40 minutes explaining what she'd been able to see so far, which included Jupiter with 3 visible moons and the Orion Nebula, which Sophie described as a smudge, but an important smudge. That's how a lot of important things start, Victoria said, as smudges. Sophie looked at her. Is that true about companies too? My company started in a one-room office with 2 employees and a router that kept dropping the connection, Victoria said. So yes, Sophie nodded like this confirmed something she'd suspected. Were you scared? Victoria thought about it. Every day for the first year. But you kept going. I didn't know how to stop. Sophie turned back to the telescope. Dad's like that, she said. He doesn't stop, even when things are hard. She looked through the eyepiece. I think that's the best thing about him. Victoria looked across the room at Ethan, who was in the kitchen doing something with onions and pretending he hadn't heard. He had heard. She knew he'd heard. They shared a look over Sophie's head, quick, specific, the kind of look that carried more than it appeared to. He went back to the onions. She looked back at Sophie. The moment passed the way those moments did, quietly and permanently. But February came. Valentine's Day arrived with the low-grade cultural pressure it always did, and Ethan navigated it the same way he navigated most things, practically without excess ceremony. He brought Victoria wildflowers from the market because she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, that she found formal bouquets performative and made dinner at his house. And Sophie made a card that said Happy Valentine's Day, Victoria, with a drawing of a car on it that was unmistakably meant to be the silver Mercedes. Victoria kept the card. She put it on the refrigerator in her apartment, which was the first thing she'd put on any surface in that apartment that wasn't functional. She didn't mention this to Ethan. He found out when he came to pick her up one evening and saw it there, slightly crooked on the refrigerator door, Sophie's enthusiastic crayon work slightly smudged at one corner, the most human thing in an apartment that was still learning to be a home. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at her and she looked back with the expression of someone who had been caught at something and had decided it was fine. "She misspelled Valentine's," Victoria said. "She always does. She knows how to spell it. She just thinks Valentine sounds better." "She's right," Victoria said. "It does." He put his hand briefly on the side of her face, just for a second, the gesture of someone who didn't need to make a production of the things that mattered. She leaned into it slightly, the way she'd learned to over these months, the small, physical grammar of two people who had grown used to each other in the ways that counted. Then they went out, and Sophie's card stayed on the refrigerator in the apartment where the walls were slowly, starting to look like they belonged to someone. March brought rain and longer days, and the first real warmth that said spring was coming to mean it this time. The shop had a week in mid-March where 3 major jobs came in simultaneously, and Ethan ran on 4 hours of sleep for 5 consecutive nights. Victoria, who was dealing with the contract renewal finally reaching its conclusion and a logistics software upgrade that had gone wrong in 3 different ways, matched him hour for hour on the exhaustion scale. They were both running on empty during a Thursday evening phone call that turned into an argument. Not a serious one, but a real one. The kind that comes when 2 tired people who care about each other are too depleted to smooth the edges. It started over something small. She'd mentioned that a logistics consultant she'd hired to advise on the software rollout had suggested overhauling a process Ethan had heard her talk through before. And he'd made a comment that it sounded like the consultant was charging a lot for advice she'd already figured out herself. And she'd said she appreciated the support, but she wasn't asking for his opinion on her business decisions. He'd said he understood. She'd said good. They'd finished the call in 3 minutes. He stared at the ceiling afterward. He wasn't wrong, exactly. She wasn't wrong either. What they'd both been was tired. And tired people pick at the edges of things. He texted, "I spoke without thinking, didn't mean to step on your process." She replied 15 minutes later, "I was short with you, long day." He typed, "Long week," then, "You okay?" 3 dots, then, "No." "Yes." "I don't know. The software thing is a mess, and Caldwell has been quietly lobbying Patterson again, and I haven't slept properly in a week." He read that and thought for a moment. Then he typed, "I'm coming over. It's 10 o'clock. I know, 15 minutes. He drove to her apartment with 2 cups of coffee from the only place still open and a container of soup from his refrigerator that had been there for 2 days but was still good. She answered the door in what he was starting to recognize as her actual home clothes. Not the blazer, not even the weekend jacket, just a worn-out university sweatshirt that she'd had long enough that the lettering was half gone, which was the most honest piece of clothing he'd ever seen her wear. She looked at the soup. She looked at him. She didn't say anything, which with Victoria was a more complete response than most people's paragraphs. He came in. They sat at her kitchen counter under the refrigerator with Sophie's card on it, and drank the coffee and ate the soup and talked about nothing important for an hour. She was too tired to be managed. He was too tired to be careful. Which meant they were just 2 people, sitting in a kitchen at 11 at night, being exactly as tired and human and imperfect as they actually were. At some point, she put her head on his shoulder. Not dramatically. Just set it there, the way you do when you've stopped performing and you're exactly where you need to be. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just sat there with her in the kitchen of the apartment where the walls were finally starting to look like hers. And outside the March rain came down on Wilmington, and the card on the refrigerator said, "Happy Valentine's Day" in Sophie's careful, crooked crayon. And the night was long and ordinary and entirely, completely enough. Spring came the way it always did in Wilmington. Not as an announcement, but as an accumulation. One morning, the light was different. A week later, the air smelled like something was waking up. The Bradford pears along the older streets bloomed their brief, ridiculous white, and Sophie declared this the best time of year, which she also said about summer and fall, which Ethan had concluded meant she had a healthy relationship with the present moment. The Caldwell situation resolved itself in April, not dramatically, but definitively. Eleanor Patterson, who had been quietly gathering information for 3 months, with the thoroughness of a woman who had been on boards long enough to know that quiet information was the most useful kind, presented a counter-analysis at the quarterly meeting that effectively closed the case on the Ohio acquisition. The debt structure was worse than Victoria had projected. The driver turnover numbers had gotten worse in the first quarter. Caldwell sat through the meeting with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that wasn't coming out in his favor. He resigned from the board 6 weeks later, citing a desire to focus on other commitments. Victoria read the resignation letter in her office and then forwarded it to Marcus with the note, "File this." Marcus filed it. He also, without being asked, quietly adjusted the coffee order in the break room to include the Colombian blend Victoria preferred, which was his way of acknowledging that she'd been through something and come out the other side. She told Ethan about it on a Sunday evening, sitting at his kitchen table while Sophie was in the bath arguing with Gerald about something that neither of them could make out clearly. "It's over?" he asked. "It's over." She had her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, which she'd been drinking more of lately, and he'd started keeping in the cabinet without mentioning it. But Patterson wants to do a board composition review in the fall. Bring in 2 new members who are more aligned with where the company's going. And where's that? Sustainable growth, measured expansion, decisions that make sense in year 10, not just year 2. She looked at the mug. What I've always wanted to do with it when people weren't trying to make me do something else. How does that feel? She thought about it genuinely. Like finishing a repair properly, she said, when you can walk away from it knowing it's right. He looked at her. She'd started doing that, reaching for his language, his analogies, the frame of reference that came from his world. He'd caught himself doing the same in the other direction, thinking about supply chains and decision trees and the logic of moving things from where they were to where they needed to be. People did that when they got close. They borrowed each other's ways of seeing. He didn't say that. He just nodded and refilled her tea without asking, and she let him. From the bathroom, Sophie's voice. "Gerald, you cannot hold your breath underwater. You're a stuffed elephant." Victoria looked at the bathroom door. "Does she always argue with him?" "Constantly." He sat back down. "She says he has strong opinions." "What kind of opinions?" "About everything. Bedtime, what she should eat, which library books to return. He's very engaged." Victoria was smiling, the real kind. He'd stopped keeping inventory of the real ones versus the managed ones, because the ratio had shifted enough that the distinction mattered less. "She's going to be fine," Victoria said. "Whatever comes, she's going to be fine. You know that." "Most days, well, all days," she said. "She has a stuffed elephant with opinions and a father who makes good pancakes. That's actually a solid foundation." He looked at her across the table. "You've thought about this." "I think about a lot of things." "What else have you thought about?" She held his gaze. "Things I'll tell you when I've finished thinking about them," she said, which was the most Victoria Hale answer in the history of Victoria Hale answers, and he accepted it the way he'd learned to accept most things about her. Not as evasion, but as process. She got there. She always got there. She just needed the trip to be on her own terms. Summer arrived and Sophie turned 8 with the weight of great significance. She had theories about 8. 8 was the age when you could do serious things. This was a position she'd developed over several months and presented to her father with the conviction of someone who had researched it. At 8, Sophie informed him, she was ready for more telescope time, a library card for the adult section on specific subjects, and the right to name any future shop vehicles that came through Cole's Auto. Ethan granted 2 out of 3 and negotiated the library card down to a list of pre-approved subject categories, which Sophie accepted under protest. The birthday party was in the backyard. Dana's backyard, bigger than Ethan's, with enough space for Sophie's classmates to run themselves into a frenzy with a sprinkler system and a piñata that turned out to be structurally overbuilt and required 3 adults and a broom handle to ultimately defeat. Victoria came. She was not practiced at children's birthday parties and showed it, standing slightly to the side of the main chaos with a cup of lemonade and the expression of someone learning the rules of a sport by watching it at high speed. Sophie found her within 4 minutes. "You have to play the games," Sophie told her. "I'm observing," Victoria said. "You can't observe. It's my birthday. Victoria looked at the game currently in progress, which appeared to involve running and shrieking and no apparent objective. What are the rules? There aren't really rules, Sophie said. You just run. That's not a game. It's my birthday game. Sophie took her hand. Come on. Later, after the piñata had been defeated and the cake had been eaten and the children had thinned out to the last few, Victoria sat on Dana's back steps with her shoes off and a piece of cake she hadn't finished. Sophie was at the far end of the yard with two friends, winding down slowly the way children did at the end of birthday parties, running at about 40% of earlier capacity but unable to actually stop. Ethan sat beside Victoria on the steps. You played the game, he said. I ran in a circle for 6 minutes, she said. Whether that qualifies as playing, I leave to the philosophers. Sophie says it counts. Then it counts. She looked at the yard. She has good friends. She picks people well. He watched his daughter. She's been doing it her whole life. Better than most adults. She picked me, Victoria said. She did. He paused. Before I did, technically. She decided at the aquarium. Based on the seahorse facts? Based on the seahorse facts and the handshake and the fact that you got down to her level without making a production of it. He looked at the yard. She notices things like that. Who does it naturally and who performs it? Victoria was quiet for a moment. I've never been good with children. I didn't know what to do with them. You're good with Sophie. Sophie is specific, she said. She's not. She doesn't perform either. She's just entirely what she is. It's easy to be around someone who's entirely what they are. She looked at the cake in her hand. I find it harder with adults. I know. Most adults aren't what they appear. Most adults are scared, he said, of something. They just manage it differently. She looked at him sideways. What are you scared of? He thought about it honestly. Failing her, he said, nodding toward Sophie. Doing something wrong that she carries around for 20 years without telling me. Missing something I should have seen. You won't. I might. That's the thing. There's no version of parenting where you get to know in advance that you didn't wreck it. You just go and then you find out later. That's terrifying. That's everything, though, he said. The shop could fail. The things I build could fall apart. The people I care about could leave or get hurt or decide I'm not what they wanted. He looked at the yard. You can't know in advance. You just decide whether the thing is worth the risk of not knowing. She was looking at the side of his face. He could feel it. Sophie is worth it, she said. Obviously. The shop is worth it. Yeah. A pause. What else? She said. He turned and looked at her, directly, without the careful layer, the way he'd been looking at her since March, since the kitchen at 11 at night, with the rain coming down and her head on his shoulder, the way you look at someone when you've stopped editing yourself in their presence. You know what else? He said. She held his gaze. Her expression was the one he'd learned best over these months. Not the CEO expression, not the managed one, not the careful professional surface, the actual one. The one that lived under all of it, a little uncertain and a little fierce and entirely worth knowing. I know, she said softly. Sophie's laugh cut across the yard, the full one, the one that involved her whole body. They both looked. She was running again. Apparently a second wind had appeared from nowhere, her friends chasing her toward the fence with the aimless joy of children who had forgotten they were tired. Victoria looked back at the cake. I want more of this, she said. Sundays and dinners and the shop and the telescope and this. She gestured at the yard, at the house, at everything. I want more of all of it. You can have it, he said. I know I can, she said. I'm saying I want it. That's different from knowing I can have it. I've known I could have it for a while. The wanting is the part I had to get to. He understood the distinction. With Victoria, wanting was the harder thing. Capable of was easy for her. Permission to want was the work. Then want it, he said. She looked at him. I do, she said simply. And that was it. No further negotiation, no managed exit from the conversation. Just that, left on the back steps of his sister's house on a summer evening, clean and true and enough. 2 years, measured from a September evening on the shoulder of Interstate 40, looked like this. a shop that had expanded to a fourth bay and added 2 employees, a fleet contract that had renewed twice and brought 2 referrals with it, a 9-year-old who had graduated from the 12-inch telescope to co-authoring a blog about amateur astronomy that had 47 subscribers, most of them adults, a company that had grown through a year of pressure and come out structurally stronger, with a board that reflected where it was going rather than where it had been. An apartment on the 14th floor that had, over 24 months, accumulated photographs and a particular Mia pottery vase Sophie had picked out as a housewarming present, and a collection of mugs that had somehow migrated from Ethan's kitchen and never quite migrated back. A ridiculous Christmas tree that had been replaced with a second ridiculous Christmas tree, this one with actual ornaments, though Sophie's hair tie tradition had been honored as a non-negotiable. 2 years looked like arguments about nothing in particular, and apologies that were faster each time because they'd both learned that the closed door was not a solution. It looked like Sophie's parent-teacher conference where Victoria had sat beside Ethan, and the teacher had referred to them as Sophie's parents without thinking about it, and neither of them had corrected her. And on the drive home, neither of them had mentioned it either, though Sophie had, from the back seat, said, "She thought you were both my parents," and left the observation hanging there without interpretation. Victoria had looked out the passenger window. Ethan had kept his eyes on the road. The silence had been the particular comfortable kind that meant everyone in the car knew what was being discussed, even without the words. 2 years looked like that. He planned it for 3 months, which was not in his nature. Ethan Cole was not a planner by temperament, preferring to read the situation and respond to what was actually there rather than build elaborate frameworks in advance. But this was the kind of thing you didn't approach without thinking it through, not because Victoria required the production of it, but because the production, in this case, was the point. The production was the statement. He told Sophie in October. He sat on the edge of her bed on a school night when she was supposed to be reading and said, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from her book. She had her father's eyes, the serious brown ones, and her mother's coloring, and something entirely her own in the particular way she watched people, like she was listening for the thing underneath the thing. "Okay," she said, "I'm going to ask Victoria to marry me." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, not surprised, not performing unsurprise, just looking, the way she always did when she was taking something in fully. "At the shop," she said. "What? Are you going to do it at the shop?" He paused. "I was thinking, yeah, actually, at the shop." "That makes sense," Sophie said. "That's where you're most yourself." She looked at her book. "And she knows that." He sat with that for a second, 9 years old, every time. "Are you okay with it?" he asked. "With me asking, with what it means." She looked back at him. "She stays for dinners on Sunday," she said. "She knows what a carburetor is now. She came to my birthday party." A pause. "She keeps my card on the refrigerator." "She does." Sophie looked at her book again. She wasn't done yet. He could tell she wasn't done yet, so he waited. "She tries," Sophie said finally. "She doesn't always know how, but she tries. That's what matters." She turned a page she hadn't read yet. "Dad." "Yeah." "Ask her." He put his hand on her head briefly, the way he'd done since she was small. She let him. Then she went back to her book, and he got up, and he went to the living room and sat in the quiet house and thought about how he'd gotten here, to this place, this life, this specific arrangement of people and obligations and love that looked nothing like he'd imagined and was better than anything he could have designed. He called Victoria and asked her to meet him at the shop on a Friday evening after closing. He said he had something he wanted to show her. She asked what. He said the Mustang. "George's Mustang." "George sold it to me," he said. "6 months ago. I've been restoring it." She was quiet. "You didn't tell me." "I wanted to show you when she was finished." A pause. "Is this the thing?" "Come at 7, he said. "Come alone." He could feel her on the other end, running calculations. Victoria always ran calculations, and he'd learned to let her run them without filling the silence. Then, "Okay," she said. 7. He spent the day on details. Dana had the rings. He'd asked her 3 weeks ago, sworn her to silence under pain of a consequence he hadn't specified, but that she'd taken seriously, which said something about her confidence in his ability to follow through. Marcus had been informed the previous week because Marcus had been with Victoria through everything and deserved to know, and also because Marcus had actually responded to the text with a simple, "It's about time," followed by a carefully chosen punctuation mark that communicated approximately 14 months of patient observation. Ray swept the shop floor without being asked, which was the closest he got to an emotional gesture. Sophie had made a card. Ethan had told her the card was a nice idea, but he needed her to keep the content general because he didn't know exactly what he was going to say, and he didn't want Victoria to read ahead. Sophie had given him a look that said, "I am 9 years old, and I understand narrative tension," and made the card anyway. He hadn't looked at it. It was in his jacket pocket. At 6:45, he pulled the Mustang out of the bay and parked it under the exterior light at the side of the building. She looked the way she looked when something had been done right. Not new, not fake new, but restored. The original red brought back to its honest best, the chrome polished to the state George had kept it in 30 years ago. The interior redone with materials that matched the period without pretending to be factory original. She was 60 years old and looked it and was beautiful for it. He leaned against the driver's side door and waited. Victoria arrived at 7:02. She parked and got out and stopped when she saw the car. She walked toward it slowly, the way she'd walked toward it the first time she'd seen it in the bay, with the particular attention of someone encountering something worth the attention. In the October evening light, she looked the way she'd looked on a September highway 2 years ago, pulled together and slightly wind-touched at the edges, polished and human in equal measure. She put her hand on the roof of the car, ran it along the chrome. "You've been working on this for months," she said. 6 months. "It's the car from the beginning," she said, "when I came to the shop the first time." "George told me he was thinking of selling," Ethan said. "I made him an offer the next day." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I wanted it," he said simply, "and because some things deserve to be taken care of the right way." She was reading him. He could feel it, the assessment running behind her eyes, the recognition of subtext. Victoria Hale had never once in their 2 years together failed to read subtext. She was reading it now. "Ethan," she said. "You asked me something," he said. "That first night, outside the restaurant. You asked if we hadn't been each other's blind date. If you'd just been a woman on the side of the road and I'd fixed your tire and we'd talked. Would I have wanted to see you again?" She was very still. The October air moved between them. "I said yes," he continued, "and I meant it. But I've thought about it a lot since then. About why. About what it was." He pushed off the car and stood straight, not performing steadiness, but genuinely steady, the way he was with most things that mattered. "It wasn't the way you looked. It was the way you asked me if stopping was worth my time. Like you'd already calculated that it wasn't and were prepared for that answer. Like you were used to not being worth people's time." Her expression shifted. Something in it went quiet. "And I remember thinking," he said, "that whoever made her feel like that was wrong. And I wanted to be around long enough to be the thing that proved them wrong." He reached into his jacket pocket. "I've been around long enough. I know who you are when you're tired and when you're fighting and when you've lost a vote and when you've won one. I know you keep Sophie's card on your refrigerator and you research telescope apertures because she was 7 and you wanted to be useful to her, and you stood in my shop in a weekend jacket and asked me to explain a carburetor because you wanted to understand my world." He paused. "You're the most careful and the bravest person I know, both at the same time." She was looking at him with the full version of her face. Nothing managed, nothing controlled, nothing performed. Just Victoria, the actual one. He opened the small box. The ring was simple. He'd chosen it carefully. Not a statement, not a performance, but something that suited her. A clean solitaire on a band that didn't fuss. Good quality without announcing itself. Something she could wear to a board meeting and to a Saturday at the shop and to a 9-year-old's astronomy blog and have it be right for all of it. "I'm not perfect," he said. "You know that better than anyone at this point. I run late sometimes. I get so deep in an engine I forget to come up for air. I've needed to apologize to you more than I planned to in year 1. He looked at her directly. "But I'm consistent. I'll show up. That's the one thing I can tell you for certain. I will show up. Every version of it. for as long as you want me to." Victoria Hale, who had built a company from nothing and held her ground in boardrooms and made decisions that other people flinched from, was crying. Not the composed kind, the real kind. The kind she hadn't shown many people in her life, that she'd kept below the managed surface for 30 years of learning that competence was safer than vulnerability. "You didn't let me finish," she said. Her voice was unsteady in a way he'd never heard it. "I'm not finished," he said. "Will you marry me?" She made a sound that was half laugh and half something that had no name, and she said yes before the question had fully cleared the air. Said it the way she'd said it on that first night, yes before he could finish, yes like it had been waiting. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a moment, then at him, then she stepped forward and he put his arms around her and they stood beside the old red Mustang in the October evening and held on with the specific grip of people who know what it took to get here and aren't taking it for granted. "Sophie made you a card," he said into her hair. She laughed. The full one, the undignified one he loved. Of course she did. He pulled back and took it from his pocket. She took it, unfolded it. He watched her face as she read it. Sophie had drawn 3 figures in crayon, one tall with dark hair, one medium with brown hair, one small with what appeared to be an elephant tucked under one arm. Above them, in her careful 9-year-old block letters, she had written, "We are better with you in the picture." And below, in smaller letters, "Also Gerald says welcome to the family. He has opinions about this too, but they are good ones." Victoria stood on the sidewalk beside the Mustang with the card in her hands and the ring on her finger and laughed until she was done. And then she folded the card carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, close to her, where she intended to keep it. The wedding was in April, not a big one. Victoria had refused big. She'd said she'd spent 15 years in rooms full of people performing importance, and she wanted nothing performed. Ethan had no argument with that. 40 people. Dana's backyard, which had been the scene of enough of their actual life that it felt right. The Bradford pears were at the tail end of their bloom, white and briefly extravagant against the April sky. Ray came in a suit that fit him the way suits fit men who rarely wear suits, which is to say with a dignified discomfort he bore without complaint. Marcus stood near the back in a perfect charcoal blazer and cried twice, which he would later deny. Eleanor Patterson sent flowers because she hadn't been able to attend, and sent a note with them that said, in its entirety, "Good decisions compound. Congratulations." Sophie was the flower girl. She took the job with the seriousness of someone who understood that jobs, when given to you, were meant to be done fully. She walked ahead of Victoria down the path they'd laid through the garden with the contained excitement of a 9-year-old holding her best behavior in both hands. She had a yellow dress, her choice, and Gerald tucked into her basket alongside the petals, because she'd made an executive decision that Gerald was part of the family, and families attended weddings. When she reached her spot beside her father, she looked up at him and said very quietly, "She's coming." He looked at the garden path. Victoria was there, but walking with the particular self-possession of a woman who didn't do anything without meaning it, in a dress that was elegant and simple and completely, entirely hers. No performance, no managed expression. Just her face, open and real, the way he'd come to know it. He had no idea what he looked like at that moment. He didn't have the capacity to track his own expression. He was just there, standing in his sister's backyard in the April light, with his daughter beside him holding a basket with a stuffed elephant in it, watching the woman he loved walk toward him with the full version of her face. The ceremony was short. The words were theirs. No templates, no borrowed language, just what they'd each written at their respective kitchen tables over several weeks, revised and crossed out and started over until the sentences were actually true. He said, "I am not the plan you made. I'm what happened instead. I hope that's been okay. I'm going to spend a long time making sure it keeps being okay." She said, "I spent a long time confusing the absence of need with strength. You showed me those aren't the same thing. You showed me by just being what you are, without explaining it or asking for credit. I'm going to spend the rest of my life learning from that." Sophie from beside them said, "Good," in a quiet voice that carried perfectly in the garden quiet, and the 40 people who'd come to witness it laughed in the specific relieved way of people who have been holding something and found somewhere to put it. Later, after the dinner, after Dana's toast that made everyone cry, after Sophie fell asleep in a garden chair with Gerald and had to be carried to the guest room by her father, after the last guests had gone and the April night had settled over the backyard, Ethan and Victoria sat together on Dana's back steps. The same steps where they'd sat on a summer evening 2 years before, when the birthday cake was half eaten and Sophie was running in the yard and the thing between them had finally been named out loud. The yard was quiet now. Lights strung across the fence, left over from the evening. The sky had the particular depth of a clear April night, dark enough to show stars. Victoria leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it, genuinely thought, the way she thought about everything. "Like I got something right," she said, "that I almost missed." He was quiet for a moment. Down the street, something moved. A car. A neighbor's dog. The ordinary sounds of ordinary life continuing to happen around the edges of the day. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Always." "The night of the blind date," he said. "I almost didn't stop." She lifted her head to look at him. "I was 8 minutes late," he said. "I was in my head about it. I saw the car, and I was past it before I decided." He looked at the yard. "I almost just kept going." She was quiet for a moment. "What made you stop?" "Habit," he said. "The way my father raised me. You see something broken, you stop." He paused. "But also, I don't know. Something told me to, something I didn't have a name for." She looked at the sky for a moment, at the stars that Sophie was learning to name. "I'm glad you're the kind of person who stops," she said. "Me too," he said. "Now." She settled back against his shoulder. The April night held them lightly, the way good things hold you, without pressure, without demand. The strings of lights made a warm glow at the edge of the yard. Somewhere in the house, Sophie was asleep with Gerald, already logged in her 9-year-old memory as the day everything got official, the day the family picture filled in completely. Neither Ethan nor Victoria said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. They'd said the things that needed saying. What remained was just the night and the quiet and the fact of themselves, here, together. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect story, but something better than either. A real one. 2 years before, on a highway outside Wilmington, a man had noticed a car on the shoulder and done the thing his father taught him to do. He'd stopped. He'd gotten his hands dirty. He'd talked to a stranger like she was simply a person, because that's what she was. He'd been late to a dinner he hadn't wanted to attend. He'd discovered, in the improbable way that real things often arrive, that the broken-down car and the ruined schedule and the flat tire on an unremarkable September evening had been, in fact, the exact right place to be. There's a version of this story where he keeps driving, where he checks his mirrors and thinks 45 minutes, she'll be fine, and merges back into traffic and arrives at the restaurant on time and meets a stranger across a white tablecloth, and they have a polite evening that leads nowhere, and he goes home to Sophie and the shop and the ordinary machinery of his life. He didn't keep driving. That's the whole story, really. He didn't keep driving, not because he knew what was waiting on that shoulder, not because he saw the future or calculated the odds or recognized the moment for what it would become. He stopped because it was the right thing to do, in the simple way that simple things are right, because someone was stuck and he was the person who could help. Because that's the kind of person he'd decided to be a long time ago, before it had ever mattered in any way he could see. The future isn't visible from the highway. It never is. You don't know, when you pull over, that you're pulling over toward anything except a flat tire. You don't know that the woman standing beside the car is going to ask you a question 2 hours later that will still be living inside you 2 years after that. You don't know that fixing one small thing will lead, through a long and imperfect and entirely unscripted chain of events, to sitting on your sister's back steps on an April night with a ring on her finger and your daughter asleep inside and the yard still warm from everything the day held. You just stop. You do the work. You talk to the person like they're worth talking to, because they are. You show up when it's inconvenient. You apologize when you get it wrong. You sit in the garage and explain the carburetor and eat soup at 11 at night and carry a Christmas tree through an elevator and play a game with no rules at a birthday party because a 9-year-old tells you to. You do the ordinary things with your whole self. And sometimes, not always, not guaranteed, not without cost or difficulty, or the specific pain of caring about something you could lose. Sometimes that's what love looks like. Not the version they show you, the actual version. The flat tire, the stranger, the stop, the whole long, beautiful, imperfect everything that comes after.